Morocco that was. Episode 3. Life at the Moorish court. Moulay Abdul Aziz's stay in Fez, the northern capital, in 1894, was not of long duration, for it was important that the court should move to the south to consolidate his throne in those regions. While northern Morocco has always been the unrestful and most seditious part of the country, it has never presented such a serious danger as the south is capable of becoming, for the northern tribes are poor, numerically in no great force, and always at war with each other. But in the Marrakesh region it is different. The rich agricultural land, and the great harvest reaped from it, render the tribes affluent. They are well horsed and well armed, and very prolific. Again, beyond the plains, the great range of the Atlas Mountains inhabited by spirited and warlike Berber tribes, to all intents and purposes unconquered. Fortunately for the welfare of a long succession of Moorish sultans, these great tribes, governed by hereditary chiefs, were nearly always on bad terms with one another, and one of the most important results accomplished by the French protectorate government in the last few years has been to form a league of the southern tribesmen. Anyone knew the old Morocco could scarcely believe that the great chiefs the Glawi, the Mtugi, the Jindafi, and the Rahamnakide would ever join hands, even in the interests of the country. But today it is so. Moulay Abdul Aziz was able to leave the north in a state of peace and security. New governors had been appointed, and Beau Ahmed's firm hand had made itself felt, and it was indispensable that the court should move south. There were already signs of unrest that could not be ignored. The arrival of the Sultan in the southern capital had a tranquilizing effect, and Beau Ahmed set to work to restore order amongst the restive tribes and to build himself a palace at the public expense. For 6 years he continued building, and every available workman and artist was employed. The result was grandiose, and the building now forms the residency of the French protectorate government. The Baia, that is to say, the effulgence, as the palace is called, consists of a succession of handsome courtyards, one planted with cypress, orange, lemon, and other fruit trees and flowers, leading one out of the other. These courts are surrounded by arcades, onto which the great rooms open. Everywhere are fountains and tanks of water. This palace must cover many acres of land, and though quite modern, is a building of singular interest. There is one courtyard which is particularly beautiful, where the Moorish architect based his art on the traditions of the past. The walls are higher, the woodwork is not painted, as is usual, in polychrome, while the court itself is not nearly as large as some of the others. The rooms themselves are perhaps less interesting than the courtyards into which they open, though in many cases the elaborately carved and painted ceilings are very good. On a very recent visit to Marrakesh I was able to wander at leisure over this great palace, accompanied by a native who was in charge, and who knew its every corner and turret, for he had been employed on its construction. I had seen it years before, or, rather, a portion of it, for I had twice been entertained at dinner by its owner, the famous Beau Ahmed. I recall now one of those evenings, the hot, jasmine-scented air of the courts, for it was late in spring, and the great dinner served in one of the saloons, while a native band discoursed anything but soft music just outside, and Beau Ahmed himself short, dark, and of prepossessing appearance, but none an excellent host. He has been dead now for 20 years, and his property, confiscated by the Sultan on his death, has passed into other hands. His name is only a memory of the past. In Morocco it was not, "How are the mighty fallen?" but "How are the mighty falling?" For almost month by month some great Qaid, some vizier, or some prince fell, and fell far indeed. Beau Ahmed had other things to think of besides his house. There was grave dissatisfaction amongst some of the tribes, particularly amongst the Rahamna, whose extensive territory lies immediately to the north of the city of Marrakesh. A leader, Taha ben Suleiman, had arisen, and under his influence the tribes revolted. The local authorities were murdered or driven out, and the rebellion became general. Its suppression took long, and cost much in lives and money. On one occasion the rebels arrived at the walls of Marrakesh and took possession of the northern suburbs of the town, but were driven back. Beau Ahmed showed considerable ability in the suppression of this revolt. Not only was his energy unceasing, but he knew also how to utilize the jealousy and mistrust that always exists among the rebels. Worked tribe against tribe, and division against division. The Muksan, by its superiority of organization, and by the means at its disposal to obtain men, arms, and ammunition, prevailed. The Rahamna rebellion was repressed, and hundreds of square miles of country were given up to fire, the sword, and pillage. The tribe was almost wiped out, hundreds died in prison, the women and children became the prey of the soldiery, and were sold or driven away to starve, and devastation reigned supreme. A few years later I traveled through the Rahamna country. It was still deserted, and the fields were grown over with thick weeds and thorn bushes. Only a few most miserable black tents, with half-starved inhabitants, remained where once the rich and flourishing Rahamna tribe had dwelt. Taherban Suleiman was captured. He was imprisoned in a cage made of the barrels of his partisans' rifles, a cage so small that he could scarcely move in it, and was exhibited to the public of Marrakesh, to be spat upon and reviled. He died in prison. As long as Beau Ahmed lived, the young sultan remained in the palace. True, he appeared at ceremonies and celebrated the religious feasts in public, but he was a non-entity. Beau Ahmed alone governed Morocco. In 1900 he died. I was in Marrakesh at the time of his last illness, when he lingered on day by day, kept alive by inhalations of oxygen. No one cared, unless it was a few of his personal followers and attendants, who would naturally suffer by his demise. As for the rest, there was a general indifference. He had never been popular, and the immense fortune he had amassed and great palace he had constructed awoke the jealousy of others who had the same desires but not the same opportunities. He was feared certainly, for his will was indomitable, and he was cruel. A sort of superstitious reverence had encircled his life, but it disappeared when sickness laid him low, and when he breathed his last, the pent-up feelings of the people burst forth, and they rose up and cursed him. The death of a great personage in Morocco is terrible, and for several days as the vizier lay expiring, guards were stationed outside his palace waiting in silence for the end. And then one morning the wail of the women within the household that death had come. Every gateway of the great building was seized, and no one was allowed to enter or come out, while within there was pandemonium. His slaves pillaged wherever they could lay their hands. His women fought and stole to get possession of the jewels. Safes were broken open, documents and title deeds were extracted, precious stones were torn from their settings the more easily to be concealed, and even murder took place. While all this was proceeding within the strictly guarded walls, Beau Ahmed's body was borne out and buried. The Sultan, weeping, followed the bier of the man who had put him on his throne and kept him there through those difficult years of his youth. He must, indeed, have felt himself alone as he stood beside the grave of his vizier, who, whatever may have been his faults, however great may have been his extortions, had been loyal throughout. When Moulay Abdul Aziz, still weeping, had returned to his palace, his first act was to sign the decree for the confiscation of all Beau Ahmed's property. It was now organized loot, for officials and slaves were turned loose to carry out the royal commands. For days laden baggage animals, half concealed under great masses of furniture, heaped with carpets and bedding, or staggering under safes, bore Beau Ahmed's property into the Sultan's palace. His women and his slaves were made to give up their loot, and the house was left empty and its owners penniless. A few days later nothing remained but the great building, all the rest had disappeared into space. His family were driven out to starvation and ruin, his slaves were taken by the Sultan to be kept or sold, and his vast properties passed into the possession of the state. It was the custom of the country. The belongings of all state functionaries passed at death to their lord and master the Sultan. I see Beau Ahmed's sons now and again. They are in complete poverty, and accept as presents with real gratitude the little sums which an upper servant in England would despise. The accepting of small presents of money is, in Morocco, not considered by any means derogatory, much less the accepting of large sums. I remember well a great-uncle of the reigning Sultan, a man who had been viceroy in his time, who regularly toured the country with a slave or two, collecting alms. He was a pleasant, genial old gentleman, and had no hesitation in asking anyone he met to help him, or in accepting the smallest of coins. On one occasion he arrived at the residence of a native ex-official of the Moorish court, who lived in Tangier. There was a tennis party going on, and the guests, amongst whom were a certain number of the representatives of the European powers, were at tea. His Highness called me aside and asked who all these Europeans were. They are, I replied, largely the ministers of the foreign powers. Aha, said the prince, they ought to be good for a pair of shoes if not for a cloak. Rich people, rich people. I was able to deter him, much to his surprise, by explaining that it was not the custom in Europe for members of the royal families to ask total strangers for coats, or even shoes, and I added that if he would wait a little I would see what could be done. I mentioned the prince's request to a few of my friends, and we subscribed between us the 6 francs necessary to purchase a pair of yellow slippers, the only footgear of the country. He was graciously pleased to accept them with the dignity of a prince of the blood. The death of Beau Ahmed naturally brought about changes at court. Whatever jealousies there may have existed amongst the viziers, and no doubt they were many, they realized that communication was necessary. Each might have, and probably would have, to defend his own particular position from the others, but collectively they had to defend their united positions from all the world. They must either succeed or fall together, and they are determined to succeed. The Sultan was now about 20 years of age, and might at any moment desire to assert himself, and the self-assertion of young monarchs of autocratic power and no experience is dangerous. The viziers realized that in all probability the disappearance of the strong hand of Beau Ahmed would tempt the young Sultan to become more independent, and it was necessary to come to some arrangement as to how he should be led to think and act. Certainly it must not be in the direction of affairs of state those the viziers meant to keep to themselves. An occupation must be found for the inexperienced and hitherto secluded monarch. It was the exact reverse of all the traditions of Morocco, but the situation was an unusual one, for there had never been a sultan in a similar position. The viziers felt that should influence be brought to bear to keep him in his palace he might rebel against this enforced seclusion, and rid himself, and probably in no gentle manner, of the men who had instituted it. No, it was clear the Sultan must be amused, and his amusements must be so numerous and so varied that his entire attention would be distracted from affairs of state. Morocco itself could not supply the novelties that would be required. Such pleasures and such luxuries as the country could produce were his already women, horses, jewels, and the whole paraphernalia that goes to make up an oriental potentate's surroundings. For further distractions, appeal must be made to Europe. It was not made in vain. It was the beginning of the great debacle, of the reckless extravagance, of the follies and the debts that led to foreign loans, and step by step to the loss of Morocco's independence. A strong and good adviser might have prolonged the life of an independent Morocco, for although possessed of no great attainments or willpower, Moulay Abdul Aziz was thoughtful, intelligent, and desirous of doing well. It was no easy matter, however, at Marrakesh, the southern capital, where the court was at this time in residence, to keep the young sultan amused. Situated 100 miles from the nearest port, which itself was 300 miles down the Atlantic coast, communication with Europe was necessarily very slow, and the sultan's ever-increasing orders of European goods took long to carry out. Often, too, the heavy Atlantic swell rendered communication impossible between the ships and the shore for weeks together. The Sultan's caterers were at their last resources. Fireworks were played out, bicycle tricks had led to bruises and sprains, and even photography had lost its pristine interest.
At this critical moment came word of a belated circus at one of the coast towns. It must naturally have been a very poor circus ever to have found itself at that dreary little port, but its advent was welcomed as enthusiastically as if it had been Barnum's entire show. Imperial letters were directed to the local cades and governors, agents rushed wildly to and fro, and eventually the circus, bag and baggage, consisting of a dozen people and 3 or 4 horses, started out across the weary plains of Morocco to obey the royal command. It all took time, and meanwhile in court circles it was the absorbing topic of conversation. 1 or 2 serious rebellions among the tribes, and an acute quarrel with the government of a European power, passed into temporary oblivion. Now, The proprietress of this circus was an extremely stout Spanish lady of uncertain age, on whose corpulent body the rough jogging on a mule for more than 100 miles had left almost as painful an impression as the discomfort, heat, and worry of the journey had upon her temper. She herself took no active part in the performance, and it was on this account, to her intense indignation and wrath, that she was refused admittance to the court of the palace in which the Sultan was to witness the show. His Majesty's orders were that none but the actual performers should be allowed to enter. So the fat lady and one or two of the employees of the circus remained in an outer courtyard adjoining the enclosure in which the Sultan, seated under a gorgeous tent, was witnessing the performance. A wall some 20 feet in height separated these two courts, and in the outer one, where the fat lady found herself, the Sultan had been building some additions to the palace, and a pile of stone, mortar, and other material reached almost to the top of the wall. The lady was both angry and bored, nor were a herd of gazelle and a few fine specimens of mouflon Barbary wild sheep that roamed about the enclosure sufficient to keep her amused. To have received a royal command to come all that way to the Moorish capital, and then to be deprived of the glory of seeing her own circus performing before a real sultan, was more than she could bear, and she straightway began to climb the great heap of building material that lay piled against the wall. It was hard work, nor was her figure suited for such mountain climbing, but she was to receive assistance from a source undreamed of. Affected, no doubt, by her slow progress in a sport of which he himself was so proficient, the old ram Mouflon lightly bounded after her. Balancing himself for a moment on his hind legs, he lunged forward and butted the fat lady so successfully from below that her ascent was materially assisted. In a series of repeated bounds, owing to no voluntary action on her own part, she found herself pantingly grasping the top of the thick wall. Meanwhile the performance of the circus was progressing to the Sultan's satisfaction. Suddenly, however, an expression of wrathful consternation became visible in his face, and, speechless, he pointed at the wall. There, far above, was the agonized and purple visage of the fat lady, peering down at the Sultan and his court. In a moment the officers of the suite were shouting and gesticulating to her to retire. But the only reply they received was a sudden vision of a considerable portion of her immense body, as a playful Mouflon, himself invisible, gave her another hoist up. At last all her body was on the wall, to which she clung for dear life with arms and legs, as she lay extended on its summit. It was at this moment that the Mouflon appeared. With a majestic bound he leapt onto the summit, stood for a moment poised on his hind legs, then suddenly dropped, and with a terrific prod from his wide horns, butted the fat lady at least a yard along the wall. He was evidently intent upon taking her round the entire circuit of the courtyard. For a few moments there was turmoil. The Sultan sat silent and amazed, while the cabinet ministers all shouted to the lady to disappear, which she was certainly most anxious to do. The slaves, more wisely, pelted the Mouflon with stones, and drove him from his point of vantage. Then slowly the lady disappeared, the fat legs first, then the heaving mass of body, and finally even the purple face was seen no more.
It was in 1901 that I became personally acquainted with the young Sultan. I had seen him once or twice, for I had accompanied Sir Arthur Nicholson's special mission to Marrakesh in 1896, but at that time the Sultan had not emerged from his shell of reserve. He was still a young boy, evidently very shy, and entirely under the thumb of Boahmed, the famous Grand Vizier. One audience that we had with him on that occasion was not without interest. We had ridden far into the depths of the great Agdal Gardens to a summer house, where His Sharifian Majesty was waiting to receive the British minister. A tangled jungle of orange trees, vines climbing over broken trellis, and clinging in festoons to great cypresses, here and there a broken marble fountain or a tiny stream, such were our surroundings. With our escort of white-robed Moorish cavalry, led by the master of the ceremonies, we rode through the great garden to dismount before a kiosk of arches and pillars, of green glazed tiles and red geometric frescoes on a yellow wall. Everywhere the tangle of vegetation had overgrown its borders. The cypresses shot up, pillars of dark green, above the building, while vine, jasmine, and geranium strove for the supremacy below. Outside the building, and out of sight of its occupants, sat a row of Moorish officers, the Sultan's attendants. At the door of the one room that the kiosk contained, for it seemed all arches and pillars without, stood Boahmed, the vizier, a dark, stout, short man, showing his black origin in every feature. Within, Opposite the doorway, on a Louis XVI settee, was Moulay Abdul Aziz. He was seated cross-legged, with his hands folded in his lap and half hidden in his soft white raiment. I remember being particularly struck with his pale complexion and his evident shyness. At the side of the divan was a chair, where the British minister was invited to be seated, while we who were in attendance stood around the door. The Sultan himself said little, and that little was addressed to his vizier in almost a whisper, and repeated by him to the British minister. In a few minutes Moulay Abdul Aziz had largely recovered his self-possession, and was busy taking in every item of the uniforms worn by the minister's suite. He could scarcely keep his eyes off one man, the present Lord Locke, whose 6'5", capped by an enormous busby, was of evidently entrancing interest to His Majesty. 4 years later, talking to Moulay Abdul Aziz in the intimacy of personal friendship, I reminded him of this episode. He laughingly replied that he had certainly been more struck with his height and uniform than anything else on that mission, and requested me to ask the British minister whether it would not be possible for Lord Locke to accompany a second embassy that was to start a few months later. This message duly reached the authorities at home, and in January 1902 Moulay Abdul Aziz, no longer shy, had the pleasure, and it was an evident pleasure, of once more welcoming Lord Locke at his court. I little thought at their first meeting, when watched the young Sultan's shy interest in the big guardsman, that a few years later I should witness the same guardsman instructing the same Sultan in the mysteries of tip and run in an enclosure of the Sharifian palace. My first private audience with Moulay Abdul Aziz was in the summer of 1901. After a considerable delay, largely owing to the discussion of the kind of obeisance I was prepared to make in entering His Majesty's presence, I was honoured with a private audience. I found His Majesty courteous, pleasant, and intelligent. He was easy to amuse, and by my departure from the austere etiquette of the court and not confining my remarks to replies to His Majesty's questions, although at first it seemed a little to surprise him, I succeeded in gaining his attention and amusement. I had been told that my audience would be very formal and last a few minutes. It lasted over an hour. The Sultan was seated, and I remained standing the whole time, to which I could not very well object. In any case, I had overcome the difficulty of my reception by refusing point-blank to go down on my knees and to touch the floor with my forehead, a form of salutation which was being practiced by the Europeans in His Majesty's service, for already he had begun to increase his Christian entourage. I had stated that I was prepared to enter the Sultan's presence in adopting the same formalities as I did in the presence of my own sovereign, and the Sultan had accepted that formula. Almost the first question he asked me was if I had ever been received in a private audience by my own king. I replied that I had experienced that honor. He then asked what obeisance I had made. I replied that I had bowed on entering the room, and again on approaching His Majesty's person. The Sultan seemed surprised, and demanded why it was the Englishmen in his service carried out the Moorish form of etiquette by kneeling and touching the floor with their foreheads. I could only protest that I didn't know, except to surmise that, as they were in the service of a Moorish Sultan, they probably thought they ought to adopt the traditional Moorish form of obeisance. The Sultan gave orders that it was to be discontinued, though, as a matter of fact, the Europeans in his service still continued to use it on the great feast days of the year until the end of his reign. A few years later, on one of these occasions I saw a long line of Englishmen drop onto their knees and bow their foreheads to the ground as the Sultan approached. It is a matter of personal option, based on prejudice. It seems to me that any human being has a right to act in such matters just as he thinks right. That he demeans himself or his country by so doing appears to me ridiculous. An Englishman, and much less England, cannot be demeaned by any fantastic gymnastics. I preferred not to do it solely for the reason that it seemed to me to be absurd, just as half the ceremonies at a British coronation would appear absurd and meaningless to a Moor. Nearly all etiquette is ridiculous, all we are more or less accustomed to it, and have largely modified its eccentricities. I have experienced things nearly as absurd as this Moorish custom in other courts. Some years ago, on one of the very hottest days of a hot summer in a country of southern Europe, I had the honor to be received by the sovereign. I arrived at the palace at 10:30 in the morning and left it at 1 o'clock. The king in question was dressed in the heavy blue uniform of an admiral. I was in a frock coat. The thermometer, even in the room, must have been in or very near the 90s. Yet we stood the whole time for 2 hours and a half. At 2:30 I was summoned back to the palace to complete this long but interesting audience. With a sigh of relief His Majesty said, "I think this time we can sit down." And we did. Why on earth we hadn't sat down in the morning during all those perspiring hours heaven only knows. I could have understood a king sitting and his visitor being made to stand, but mutual discomfort and fatigue in such a case and for such a length of time appears to me to be almost childish folly. The Moorish protocol would have compared favorably with this European etiquette. The Moorish visitor would have made his lowly obeisance to the sovereign, but this done he would have squatted down, more or less comfortably, in his sultan's presence, and remained seated till the end of the audience. It seemed to me to be preferable. But etiquette is all a question of custom and habit. Take kissing, for example. How well every man must remember how, when a small boy, he feared that his mother might kiss him in the presence of his schoolfellows. In after years, when it is too late, how he would have treasured those lost kisses were they now obtainable. What amusement, too, the kissing of foreign men on the railway platforms of the continent has caused us. But witness the meeting of two great Morocco chiefs, the stately approach, the last few more hurried steps, and the graceful embrace as each bends forward and kisses the other's shoulder. I have seen the meeting of great men in Morocco in the hour of sorrow, when they have fallen upon each other's necks and wept. How few soldiers know that the origin of the salute they give today comes from the East, and is really no more than the movement of the subject to shield from his eyes the effulgent glory of his sovereign, only today it applies equally to the effulgent glory of his second lieutenant as well. Habit is everything, and prejudice scarcely less. These were the first days of the toys and fireworks at the Moorish court. For a time the latter were paramount, and almost nightly the southern capital was illumined by the reflection of Catherine wheels and startled by the flashing of the many colors of marvelous rockets. A man was brought especially from England to show and prepare the fireworks, and he became a permanent member of His Majesty's suite. The natives were partly amused, partly shocked. Thrifty as the Moor is by nature, he could not overlook the wild extravagance of this manner of spending money, and the fireworks by the time they had arrived in Marrakesh had cost a pretty price. Freight, insurance, and the long caravan transport from the cost had to be added to the original cost, and there was an item known as commission. They were certainly very beautiful fireworks and very expensive. I was present at a display given to amuse a British minister, who highly disapproved of this extravagance, but could not refuse the invitation. There was a set piece of an enormous elephant, and the show concluded with a waterfall of fire in a new shade of pink, just discovered, and accordingly of elevated price. It was certainly very beautiful, but it was very useless and very dear. One afternoon the Sultan informed me that there would be a display that night in the palace grounds, but that it was for the palace, that was to say, the ladies and no men would be invited, but if I went up onto the roof of the house in which I was living, I should no doubt be able to witness something of it.